I have extreme FOMO because I really wanted to do this in person, but unfortunately, COVID, being South African, not having a free pass, meant that I was not able to come in person. So we're going to be doing this virtually. And I'm really glad that this is still happening. I actually literally did just pack up my stuff, but this is awesome. I have prepared a presentation that's going to be looking into some of Zerion's analytics, and obviously can't ask you guys to raise your hand of who here actually uses Zerion. Maybe you guys, I mean, you could log in and use the chat, but that's okay. So brief intro on Zerion. We are a DeFi investing platform. Some of you might be familiar with us if you've ever connected an Ethereum wallet or checked an asset page or used it to do portfolio tracking or actual investing. We're one of the apps that you would use. I currently lead growth efforts at Zerion. I'm originally from South Africa and have been at the team for about a year and a half now. So I'm super interested in digging into some of the analytics because I think that as DeFi scales, we have this question of, well, who's actually using DeFi and how do we design better consumer products to make the investing experience a little less jargon filled and a little bit less complex than it currently is. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen and we'll basically just get started. I'll also try and keep this to around under 15 minutes so that we do have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end. Yes, give me a second to pull that up. Thanks. Okay, here we go. So this is mapping the DeFi crowd. Can you just give me a verbal indication if you can see this? Awesome. All right, so I guess the first place to start is just to acknowledge that DeFi has been exploding. If we look at this, three main metrics that we often talk about, we've seen like a 57% increase in the number of Ethereum wallets. 12-month DEX volumes are up 489%. And if you look at total value locked, a la DeFi Pulse, that is up 22 times. And of course, my personal favorite is that my grandmother is now sending me emails asking me things like, what is an NFT and what is total value locked? I think for me, that was the real sign that, okay, things are getting mainstream now. But this also begs the question of, are these the metrics that we should be looking at and how helpful are they? Because we see these being shared a lot in media and social media, and it's obviously something that protocols and DEXs will look at the most because it makes the most sense to be focusing on volume. But from the perspective of users and designers and builders, we do have to question whether it's guiding us into building better products. And that's the question that I want you to keep back of mind as we go through this presentation, because arguably these stats don't actually say much about who uses DeFi, right? They don't tell us how people are using protocols. In fact, you'll find that there's actually very little correlation between things like volume and number of traders, and that's barring the obvious ones like Uniswap. When you get into some of the weeds of the stats, it becomes a little bit more ambiguous and becomes more difficult to craft an actual narrative about the kind of people and what their needs are. And then, of course, that also does lead us into a situation of sometimes not having the best signaling of where we find information, right? So this goes down to user personas on the product side, but also in terms of the narratives that we create around who the DeFi community actually is. Unless you're in a community yourself, often there's just very bad signaling. And so we end up getting those signals from echo chambers and places that perhaps aren't based on the actual data, but are sometimes based on, who is the loudest in the room or what gets the most memeified and what gets the most shared. So in this presentation, hopefully we're going to cut through some of that and look at the actual data of how people are using some of the most popular DeFi products, and Zerion obviously being one of them. Before I do that, though, it is obviously worth talking about how Zerion handles data. So as with most DeFi products and protocols, we're pretty strong in terms of how we feel about user privacy and data. And I want to make it clear that any information that you are going to be seeing in this presentation can largely be taken on chain, or it's based on anonymized product analytics that help us create a better user experience. But there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning here. The first is that we obviously are a zero KYC product, so we wouldn't be collecting things like user emails involuntarily or as a requirement to use the product. We also don't do any cross-association of wallet data. So if you yourself use Zerion and say you have 10 wallets connected, there is nothing on our back end that would enable us in the first place to even cross-associate those. We wouldn't be able to match wallet A to wallet B, C, and D. That's information we just don't have access to. And then we obviously don't collect things like IP. If you have an ad blocker, that means you're also blind to your data, and so forth. And of course, if you have any questions about that afterwards, please do feel free to ask. But that is the gist of where this data is coming from and how that's being handled. That being said, Zerion is in a pretty good position to talk about how people are accessing DeFi. So we are one of the most widely used products for how people access this in terms of just their day-to-day investing app. We serve users in 150 plus countries. We have anywhere between 200,000 and 250,000 monthly active users. And we saw that number go up by about 276%. And this is since July 2020. So looking at the last year. In terms of more detailed demographics, given Google Analytics isn't always going to be the most accurate here because a lot of our users do use ad blockers, but it's probably pretty representative to say that we have an 80-20 gender split. 6 months ago, that was 90-10. So, we're making progress, and we have a median trade size of $1,000 and really do serve everyone from complete newbies who are creating a wallet for the first time on our platform to your degens and your whales who have $1 million plus in their portfolio. And some of them are using it for just tracking. Others are using it for actual investing as well, because we do things like DeFi aggregation. And I suppose just to illustrate what that distribution actually looks like, if you look at the wallet balances here, and you might not all be able to see this because I noticed there was a pretty big screen up, but we have a fair distribution from people who have less than $100 in their wallet, about 140K who have between $100 and $1,000, and then going further down those buckets, $1,000 to $10,000, $10,000 to $50,000, and then above $50,000. And this, to be clear, is also just data on every single wallet that has ever connected to Zerion. So that explains the numbers that you're seeing here. Same diversity is also seen in wallet providers. So this chart is also, again, looking at any wallet that is ever connected to Zerion. We have many people who use our product purely for watching different addresses. So you'll see that there's usually a distinction between the wallets that you use for everyday trading. We call that the My Wallet section. And then we have the watched wallet, so people would use that just for whale watching, or we've also seen use cases where people are using that to see active hacks that are going on. Fortunately, we have a history page that usually does parse things really easily, but you have a pretty fair distribution, and an unsurprising one as well. We have most people using MetaMask, quite a few using Trust, Wallet Connect, Coinbase, and what you can't see is like Iron Token, Ledger, and some of the other popular wallet providers. So that's just a general overview of how people are using Zerion. But it's also interesting to look a little bit deeper into user personas. And to be clear, these are analytics-based user personas. There are probably so many different ways that you could categorize this. The three buckets that we've chosen for this presentation are really just newbie, explorer, and pro. But you can imagine you could delineate these along the lines of risk, right? So you could be looking at things like percentage of total DeFi portfolio that is expressed as debt. You could be looking at things like how many social tokens does a person interact with, and so forth and so forth. But for the purposes of this, I'm mainly going to look at the just like main data points that we would use to categorize different user personas. So for a newbie, right? This is someone who is either just starting out with DeFi or crypto. You'd see them having a personal wallet value lower than $1,000. Average trade size is well less than 500, and they're probably interacted with less than 2 protocols. For an explorer, this is kind of your in between, where someone who's interacted with 2 to 3 protocols, they might be fairly familiar with DeFi and crypto. They might even have more than one wallet, but their total wallet balance is going to be anywhere between $1,000 and $10,000. And then finally, your pro bucket, which would be anyone who has a personal wallet balance above $10,000, is trading on average above $1,000 a trade and has interacted with several protocols. And you also tend to see them using some of the more, quote unquote, advanced features, right? So looking at the actual history stats, clicking on those different balances and transactions, and then perhaps even doing things like using our parser for exporting CSVs and using that for tax purposes. So that's like the general definition. And you do see these categories coming out pretty clearly when you actually look at, say, the last 90 days of how people have been using the app. So if we look at just trade sizes alone under the newbie category, you'd see a median trade size of around $80, so fairly low. But the 90th percentile there is still well under 500, and that's around 407, meaning that this is pretty much the highest bucket the highest trade size that you'd see in that bucket. For explorers, a median trade size of $340, and that's over the 90-day period. 90th percentile of 2,800. So we clearly have a much higher range here. This is a much larger proportion of users as well. And then for pro, a median trade size of $2,000 with the 90th percentile at 13,500. But obviously you could go into the 99, and that tends to be a lot higher as well. We haven't created a separate category for whales. So I'd imagine that those numbers would also be very different there. But all of this being said, this is how we would look at things like portfolio value and trade size. What's also super interesting in terms of the data that we look at is just seeing how across these personas, you often see a very strong correlation with where the market is. And the chart that you're looking at right now is just general Zerion activity with Ethereum price. And it is almost surprising how closely that is tracked. So when I say activity, this is really just any event on the app. This could be something as simple as connecting a wallet. It could be clicking on an asset page. It could be placing a trade, just a generic, you interacted with the app in some way. And this is across the mobile, iOS, Android apps, and the web app itself. Interestingly, if you zoom in around January, you might see this spike in activity, and that alone can be contributed to just one viral tweet that Elon Musk happened to like. So we rarely do see strong correlation with the kind of activity on social media, which itself is very market driven. And I think that that is unlikely to change anytime soon. But we also see this in way more detail. So in this chart, you're looking at the number of people that are sharing on asset pages. So if you've ever gone onto an asset page on Zerion, you'll see that we have this tweet button. And that too is very closely correlated with Ethereum price movement. This here is a smooth chart. So this is anyone who's deciding to share an asset page. This is sort of the generic tweet that the tweet template that you can share. And this probably also speaks to the fact that prices in general in crypto are also very correlated. So most prices tend to be correlated with the Ethereum. And that's basically what's going on here, because even if you're sharing for a different asset page, usually is the case that it's, on a bull run when Ethereum is on a bull run and vice versa. But this isn't always necessarily a good thing. One thing that really surprised our team recently was realizing that the average user on our mobile apps was opening it 9 times a day. And that seems insanely high, but that is the average. And that's looking at 150,000 users in total across Android and iOS. At the peak, that was actually 15 times a day. And so it's moments like these where as a team, we have to pause, because these are numbers that are far higher than, say, social media. We also get a lot of community members saying things like, Zerion is replacing checking Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. That is probably dependent on the direction of the market. But that's the kind of feedback that we were hearing, at least during some of the, the highest frenzy, say towards the beginning of the year. And you can zoom out, there's a lot more studies being done now around things like just general health and sanity checking with financial markets. You can go and find them. There's really one interesting one around BTC price volatility and its correlation with stress and poor sleep. So this is something that our team does actually spend a great deal of time thinking about, because obviously we love designing beautiful apps. We love designing things that people use, that are useful to them, bringing an aggregated, seamless experience to what can sometimes be a very fragmented and complex space. But we also want to do that in a way that is scalable and sustainable. Because ultimately, we don't want to just be repeating the mistakes of the traditional financial world. So I kind of want to segue into this, and I'd love to actually bring in a Q&A here, which is just how do we build, design, and communicate a better DeFi? Two things really stand out, which is firstly catering to all user types. And I think this is something that all apps, including ourselves, can do a lot better on. And the next steps there are really to combine quantitative and qualitative data. So perhaps ETC 5 next year, maybe we can do that one in person as well. And then also just having apps that respect our privacy and our sanity. And I think the two really go hand in hand. So I'm going to stop there. I'd love to open this up if you have any questions. I'm sure you could just ask out loud, or maybe there's someone that could moderate that. But that's essentially all from me, and I'll leave the rest for the Q&A. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So to clarify, all of the stats that we would give around daily active users or monthly active users are based on user IDs, right? So this is not wallets, right? This isn't, a handful of people who each have 100 wallets connected or anything like that. When it comes to separating between the wallets, or at least attempting to separate between the wallets and then match them to user IDs, that's something that we actually don't do. So as I mentioned, if you're someone that does have 10 wallets on Zerion, we're not going to be able to say your wallet A is associated with your wallet B. Obviously, that's data that you could probably try and scrape on chain. I mean, anyone can do that, but we don't do that because that actually just doesn't really align with our privacy policy. And this is something that we are thinking about, because obviously as we scale, there is the question of, well, sometimes it is also just very useful to have this kind of data. And I mean, I'm very open to hearing ideas around that, but at the moment, it's not something that we even attempt to address. We hope so too. Unfortunately, it isn't there. I mean, we do get some really interesting questions though. One thing that I would share is, like, we recently had a user who said that he was using different Google profiles, because sometimes there's a lot of ambiguity. I mean, you can go and check our privacy policy. It's zerion.io/privacy.pdf. But a lot of people are sometimes paranoid that we are doing that association of wallets, and so this person was using different Google profiles on Chrome, and having different wallets on them. But that's not a very good fix, and it's not one that you necessarily need anyway. Thanks so much. Cheers.
Hey, how's it going?